Hi, everyone. We're going to give you another minute for folks to roll into the room, but this is the webinar Online Learning. We'll continue this fall. What do reporters need to know? As I say, we'll give it a minute or so for more people to come into the room. If you've just joined us, we will get started in a moment. Stay tuned. Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar. The title is Online Learning Will Continue This Fall. What do reporters need to know? I'm Eric Robelin, the Deputy Director at EWA. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a query for our speakers, type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel, including your name and affiliation. You can submit a question at any time, and we will get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of this webinar, which will come after some opening presentations and conversation before that. Also keep an eye on the chat box today, where we will post some resources from our speakers. One other thing, as soon as this webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important and helps us improve. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Erin Golden, an education reporter at the Star Tribune newspaper in Minneapolis. Erin has produced some excellent coverage on the topic of today's webinar, including an August 15th story, part of an occasional series. That piece is headlined, "As Minnesota schools' online options grow, so do complications." And she, in the story, talks about the surge of Minnesota, both public schools and districts, that are launching new online programs this fall, with a similar pitch she's hearing of flexibility, innovative instruction, engaging learning experiences for students of all ages. But this poses a lot of challenges as families and students and journalists try to figure out, what's the quality of these offerings, and are they ready to deliver on those promises that they put forward. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic to Erin, who will introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Erin?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to everybody for joining. I'm excited other people are interested in this topic. That's really caught my attention on my beat covering statewide education in Minnesota, and seeing just the vastly growing landscape of online learning, not just in the emergency format we've all seen over the last year and a half, but in a more permanent version, and the many forms that can take. So we have a couple of great and very knowledgeable speakers here. They're both going to be able to talk a little bit about the national landscape of what's happening. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we're going to have a lot of time for what I hope is a lot of other questions to come into. So first we have Julia Kaufman, who's a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and co-director of RAND's American Educator Panels. She studies a wide variety of topics in instruction, and teaching and learning, including virtual instruction. And she's going to be able to share about the trends that she's been seeing through the work that RAND has done, surveying school administrators, teachers, and parents. We also have Christopher Harrington, who's the director of the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, He's been a teacher, administrator, education researcher, and consultant, and he's worked with school districts all around the country as they develop their own virtual learning and blended learning programs. So I think we'll start with Julia and hear about what she's been learning.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'm just going to share my slides here in a minute. Okay, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. Really looking forward to the Q&A especially. I'm gonna just touch on two topics with my brief comments. First, I'm gonna talk about what we've learned from surveys we've fielded to nationally representative samples of school leaders and teachers over the course of the past year. Many of you are probably familiar with a lot of this, but some of it is just worth repeating. And then I'll segue into the critical questions I'm thinking about for the coming year based on what we know about school district plans. So one key learning from COVID that I come back to again and again is that teachers and principals in schools serving our most disadvantaged children were most likely to be fully remote for most of the school year. So what I'm showing you here is from our October survey. That was in October 2020, where we asked school leaders about what instructional mode they currently had. And we're looking at these data by school poverty and by schools with the highest percentages of students of color. And
Julia, I'm gonna have you pause for just a second. I think it might be just me, but I think your screen isn't showing up. So I wanna make sure we can fix that so everybody can see it.
It looks to me like it's showing up. So does no one else see it?
I'm only seeing a white screen.
Oh, okay.
I don't see it either, Julia.
Let me see if I can remedy that. Sorry about that. I'll stop sharing my screen. Now you're seeing nothing, right?
Right.
Okay, now I'm gonna share.
There it is.
You got it?
Yeah, that should be fixed.
Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that. So what I'm showing you here is school leaders' reports about whether their school was fully in-person, hybrid, or fully remote. So I'm going to dig a little bit more deeply than what you see right here. So if you're a student in a school with 75% or more students of color, you were about 8 times more likely to be in a school that was fully remote in October compared to a student in a school with 75% or more white students. And if you were a high poverty student in a high poverty school, you're about twice as likely to be fully remote. So these trends are just important because there are big implications for what we can know about how well remote schooling went. We don't really know what the outcomes were because the students that were getting remote schooling were really different than those that didn't. And when we looked at this data again in March when we surveyed school leaders, disparities were certainly still there. I know a recent report from the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice confirmed this pattern using a different data set. So it's definitely a pattern that's been present. One reason that this is really important is because millions of children had dramatically lower quality learning experiences this year, and especially if they were in fully remote settings. So now I'm showing you data from March when we surveyed school leaders and teachers. And we asked school leaders and teachers to tell us what was your operational model, fully in person, hybrid, or fully remote, for the majority of the year. And then we asked them a range of questions. So when you look at the inputs, not the outcomes, right, we can see that schools that were fully remote for most of the year were more likely to have a shortened school day, more likely to report decreased instructional minutes. Teachers were more likely to say that they would not have covered all or nearly all the curriculum that they would typically cover. And it's also really hard to know how students in fully remote settings were doing because schools often change grading policies to assign incompletes rather than failures for students. And we know that lots of students just pass to the next grade level, although we know less about their performance. We also know less about their performance because students were absent for many, many school days. And it's a little hard to overestimate the impact of that. Our data suggests that roughly 1 in 10 students, regardless of instructional mode, missed the majority of school days in 2021. Just to give you a way to compare. In a normal school year, we estimate that about 15% of kids are what we call chronically absent, defined as missing 15 or more days a year. That's roughly 1 to 2 days per month. But according to our survey data, about 15% of students were absent 1 to 2 days a week over the 2021 school year. And that's absences according to teachers' reports. So a lot of students were just not there during the school year. And of course, we know that technology issues did abound. Even in schools that were mostly remote, students were sometimes not with an adequate internet connection. When we surveyed principals, about 12% who had been fully remote for most of the year said their students did not have an adequate internet connection, which really begs the question of how well those students could have done with remote learning. So all this just suggests to us that teachers' jobs this year are really difficult. They're facing a lot of disparities in academic performance and a lot of concerns about children that haven't even been in school very much. I know my kids just started school last week, and it is overwhelming to be in a school with a lot of other kids. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that and the need for more SEL, socio-emotional learning, and mental health interventions. I mean, in an ideal world, the teachers will know which kids have missed a lot of school and figure out what they need and match them up with evidence-based interventions, but we don't know the extent to which districts are doing that yet. So I'm just gonna raise 3 critical COVID-related questions that I'm thinking about for this school year. The first is how much guidance and clear, consistent messaging about health and safety states and school systems are providing, and how is that affecting instruction for everyone? According to a recent analysis that many of you might have read from the Center of Reinventing Public Schooling, just 5 states, Colorado, Maine, Michigan, Nebraska, and Rhode Island, provided specific health indicators or benchmarks to guide reopening right when school systems needed that information, like late July, early August. And to make things more complicated, 8 states have restricted what types of virtual learning districts can offer, only allowing remote instruction in state of emergency. And of course, in many states, there are prohibitions against mask mandates. And so it just seems as if state legislation is actively working to make school reopening decisions and parents' decisions about whether to send their child back to school as difficult as possible in some states. Particularly, we're concerned about states where there are densely populated areas facing upticks in COVID. And if parents are faced with sending their children back to school in a school where masks aren't going to be worn, what do they do? So those are just some things to think about. And then the second is how are districts spending COVID-19 funds? We know that districts are seeing unprecedented funding, almost $190 billion in ESSER funds since March 2020 are going to districts. We've surveyed districts about this, and districts do have a lot of discretion. About 1/3 of the districts we surveyed back in June said they had complete discretion on how to spend the funds, while 2/3 said they have some discretion. There's a lot of concern about how to spend these funds, especially in high poverty districts. We do know, though, that a lot of districts are spending funds on technology. And we see a big uptake in the one-to-one device ratios, support for online hotspots and online connectivity. So districts are doing a lot in that area, but they're faced with this question of how to spend money that you expect will go away and how to spend it in the most sustainable ways. And lastly, as I'm sure you know from just all the research that has been out already, is that remote learning will happen in some school systems. When we surveyed districts back in June, and this is from a forthcoming publication that I'm happy to share an embargoed copy with you of, it's coming out on Monday. And when we asked school systems whether they're planning to run a virtual school this year, 1/4 said they are, and that's up 23 percentage points from in past years, pre-pandemic. So virtual schools, very much a new phenomenon. So the big question is, to what extent is technology capacity in terms of teacher knowledge and ability to pull off remote learning and their instructional strategies leading to high quality teaching and learning for those that choose to be virtual? And is it comparable to what's happening for in-person kids? So that's just a taste of some of our data and a little bit about what we're learning and what we're thinking about. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you. So many different subjects in there with plenty of questions to come. But Christopher, if we could hear from you too about the work that you've been doing in Michigan, that would be great.
Sure, if I could have presentation privileges. All right, there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, you can see my screen, correct? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Chris Harrington. I'm coming from Pennsylvania, actually outside of Philadelphia, although I do lead the Research Institute at Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. I serve as the director. And I've been in education as a teacher for more than a decade, another 15 years as an administrator in school systems. And as Erin mentioned earlier, I did spend some time doing consulting, and I still do, with schools across the country. I also served as a higher ed faculty member in a doctoral program for educational leadership. So I've been immersed in the education space for about 30 years now. And yeah, you see a lot of things in 30 years, right? It's really interesting, that last chart that Julia shared about schools looking at starting their own virtual programs. And I have some slides here that I'll share with you that talk about how schools are looking to move forward, because we have seen schools on the ground outside of research, but just in practice. I work with probably about 10 to 15 school superintendents in a given week. And we're talking about innovative learning models. And of course, what's dominating the topics of conversation right now are around returning to school. How do we make our virtual learning experiences better for kids? So I do have some insights there and where schools are looking to move to actually make those experiences better. So the first thing I wanted to talk about first is that, you know, we know that back in the spring of 2020 that everybody was in triage mode, and it was extremely difficult. Teachers who were accustomed to teaching in a face-to-face environment, which was the vast majority of teachers across the country, were now thrust into this remote learning model. And I do want to make a distinction here. I call this pandemic teaching and learning, not to be confused with what we know to be truly effective virtual learning. There is a difference there, and I know Erin referenced that also. Where we saw teachers back in the spring of 2020 and actually moving into the start of the 2021 school year, which we wrapped up, we saw teachers just getting by with good enough digital content. They were creating content on the fly, which is probably the worst case scenario for creating digital content, because it's extremely difficult to do while also trying to move kids forward. So designing that kind of instruction on the fly is always a challenge. And we also saw that one of the common problems that the teachers experienced was that student engagement piece. It was a widespread problem across the board. Julia's statistics talk about, you know, some kids who don't even show up, but even when kids show up and they can connect and they can log in to wherever they're supposed to log in for class, the level of engagement even there was down because the learning experiences weren't designed as well as they could have been. And it's not because we don't have good teachers out there. What we had was a situation where we're asking teachers to do something that they didn't have any experience doing before. And they didn't have any training in how to do it. So it's kind of like throwing somebody in the deep end of a swimming pool who's never swum before and say, go ahead and swim. There's a lot of flailing that goes on. There's a lot of choking and gasping that goes on. And we saw a lot of that with our teachers. So knowing that that's where we've been, not just in spring of 2020, but throughout the 2021 school year, in our work with schools and districts within the state of Michigan, but also across the country, and some of our own research through the Institute, we know that schools are going to be continuing to ramp up to provide some virtual instruction and do it better than they have done in the past. And, you know, I guess you can say back in spring of 2020, you know, parents and the school communities have given some grace because, well, we were all thrown into this situation. They expected more during the 2021 school year. And I would say schools generally got better than they were in spring of 2020. but it still wasn't where it needed to be, as you can see from Julia's statistics. Shortened class day or school days, less content or curriculum being covered. But where we see schools now, that also aligns with what Julia talked about, is the acquisition of computing devices and addressing internet issues, making sure that students can connect. This whole push for more and more digital content is something that we're seeing. This includes what are called learning management systems. It would be where your digital content is housed that can actually be used to create the learning experience for kids. It's where kids engage with the content, where they can engage with the teachers. So, so we're seeing a continued push. In fact, I'd say the pandemic served as a catalyst for a lot of schools moving in this direction already, but now it's just imperative. And in addition to those devices and the digital content, there's also this need, this growing need now, and a lot of weaknesses were pointed out in terms of data systems. So your learning management system, your student information system, your student performance, your data tracking systems, all these systems needing to work together to be able to allow teachers to work with kids in an appropriate way and in a seamless way, in a way that's really effective. So we're seeing a focus there as well. And you buy all this technology, you buy all these systems, you start putting all this in place, professional development rises to the forefront then. And professional development, I look at it two ways. There's training, and that's how to use this stuff, how to turn it on, how to click here, how to set up your class, that kind of thing. But that's the training pieces of it. The professional development piece is really at the heart of where we can start making virtual learning or remote instruction better for kids. And this is around how do you use the technology in the class? How do you structure a digital learning experience for kids? How do you engage with kids to provide feedback to allow for those collaborative, interactive activities that nurture engagement? So we're seeing professional development really focusing around the areas of student engagement and the relationship development. That was such a pain point last year for schools and districts. At the Institute, we decided, you know, why don't we do this? Why don't we survey and pull the best practices, the most effective practices from teachers who teach in virtual models and the administrators who supervise those teachers? Why don't we pull some of those most effective practices and share those with the rest of the country who's really struggling here? So Michigan Virtual is part of a what's called the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance. It's 17 statewide virtual schools and programs whose sole purpose is to provide supplemental or full-time learning experiences for kids, online learning experiences. This is what they do. They don't teach face-to-face. It's all virtual. So all of their structures and supports for teachers and kids, it's all been refined over the years. Their professional development, their teacher supervision practices, all are aligned to virtual teaching and learning. So this is really significant, these statistics here. A survey of 1,800 of these educators, over 1,700 of them being virtual teachers, and nearly 100 administrators who supervise those teachers. And so this particular data collection, this survey actually generated two reports. One report was around how to engage students in virtual learning environments and how to engage, or I'm sorry, how to support teachers teaching in those virtual learning environments. And the Michigan Virtual website there is where you can find these. And I can, at the end, share my contact information, and you can reach out to me at any time as well. But here are the basic findings, just in a nutshell. There's a lot of good detail in these reports that I'm not doing it justice with this one slide, but if you want some concrete specific examples, the reports share that. But as far as student engagement strategies go, some of our top findings were that if there are varied formats of digital content, meaning some videos, some reading, some interactive manipulatives on websites, some audio, different ways to engage learners. These are different formats to engage learners. This is what teachers did not have the luxury of being able to create back in spring of 2020 and even moving through the 2021 school year. There just was not enough time because it takes time and it takes a lot of intentionality and training to actually, and professional development to get it there. We also found that synchronous communication is huge for engaging kids. Okay, and that is something where it's another level of time commitment, it's another kind of a skill set in how to communicate with kids in a virtual environment. And we hear of Zoom fatigue, and we hear of teachers and kids getting really stressed out and difficulties connecting. That all interfered with synchronous communication, but there's some insights there. And the personalized feedback, which is critical to the development of relationships, those are all, that is another communication structures and strategies is all part of the development of relationships and how to humanize the experience for kids. So it's not just kids and a computer and that's it. How do you actually develop those relationships is key. And then how to support teachers. You can see the categories here on the screen. Professional development was huge in different ways, the professional development, and how you grow teachers through the supervision, the teacher supervision process, which also ties directly into professional development. And so does the providing mentorship and some collaboration opportunities. Work-life boundaries and school culture is really huge as well. So these are some of the big findings here. In each of these reports, there's an implications section at the end of each of those reports that says what school leaders can do, what teachers can do. And I think that would be a great starting point for a lot of conversations if you have conversations with schools moving forward. So I will close out on another final thought here. There is a bigger picture to this whole virtual learning thing. It's not just about the teaching practices, and it's not just about how administrators support teachers in a virtual environment. That is critical, it's important, that's like right there, front lines. But there are other components that actually make a virtual learning program successful. So we talk about having a real vision and a coherent program that meshes with an existing academic program within a school or district, and really articulating what that means. Because once you have that, you can start wrapping around these other structures, like how curriculum instruction and assessment is aligned with some of the face-to-face experiences you might be providing. And then the technology to support both platforms, how professional development needs to be structured within both formats of learning, and even school operations, your school day, your bell schedules, facilities. All of these are big pieces that will help support whatever is going on in that virtual classroom. The underpinning, of course, is leadership and the commitment to actually make all this work. I have a lot more information on that I'd be more than happy to share, but I will close with a couple of resources. I'm going to skip down to that very last resource there. All those structures that help support virtual learning programs, there's a national set of standards out there. I'm fortunate to sit on the leadership team for developing these standards of quality online learning. And there's standards for programs in general, for courses, online courses, and for online teaching. So this are a set of standards, some ideals that schools and districts can work toward to actually create very effective and highly rigorous virtual learning programs. But there's some other resources here too. There's one here called Guides to Online Learning. That's published by the Research Institute. And there's 6 guides, and it helps different stakeholder groups work towards higher quality experiences in virtual learning. There's a guide for students, a guide for parents, a guide for teachers, a guide for administrators, a guide for school boards. There's also a guide for what we call in Michigan mentors. By law, any online learner is supposed to have an on-site school mentor assigned to them to help guide them and support them in their work. But I would say, regardless if whether you have that in your own states, it's there's usually an adult at the school that is assigned and tagged to working with that child. So that's certainly helpful. And of course, there's copies of the report here as well. So again, like I said, here's my contact information. That's my cell number. Feel free to text me. It's probably the quickest, best way to get a hold of me these days. But if any questions you have and want to dive into some of those details, I'm at your disposal.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. I'll jump in with a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to everybody participating. One question that probably doesn't have an answer yet, as you noted, many school districts around the country have already started. Some will, like here in Minnesota, in a couple of weeks. What do we know so far about who is choosing remote instruction this year and why they're doing it? And I'm thinking here specifically about, do we have a sense of the balance between people who are doing it specifically for COVID-related reasons and people who have decided for other reasons that this is a good fit?
I can start. We know a little at RAND. I don't think we know very much yet, though. We surveyed parents back in July, and I can share that report with you, but that was back in July, far before the Delta variant started really picking up. So I'll share that link with the organizers and panelists, and they can share it back with you. But I mean, there was definitely a portion of parents, about 84% back in May, said that they would plan to send their children back to school. And then I think a little bit later that the numbers even went up, that yes, I'm planning to send my child back to school. But I think all the confusing information that parents are getting is making that decision really hard now as COVID's picking up again.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Julia, the whole fact that the Delta variant is now becoming front and center and the impact on kids, I think that's changing some folks' mind. And I'm hearing every day from school superintendents that they're dreading their upcoming board meetings because these protests about masks, no masks, police attending school board meetings, I think these kinds of things will could have an impact on families just choosing, you know what, I'm just going to stick with virtual learning again. And it's my sense from talking with school leaders is their enrollments in virtual learning programs skyrocketed during 2020, obviously, and even at the start of the 2020-21 school year. And while they're not expecting to see those same levels of enrollments, they are expecting to be above average. So, and I think that's evidenced in Julia's statistics that she shared also, is that schools are really looking at this being more and more. But keep in mind, it's not just the pandemic that's making or asking or causing people to make these choices. There are also some families who learned through this experience in the 2021 school year that, hey, online learning really works for my kids. Erin, I think you referenced some of that in some of your recent articles, but there are families that realize, oh my gosh, this is something that works for me and for my family. And so the cat's out of the bag in some instances, and it's causing school districts to respond to some of the demands of families now. I want online learning.
I will just say one other thing, and that's that there are a lot of disparities in the parents that feel safe sending their children back to school, and definitely more Black, Hispanic, and Asian parents felt more hesitant than white parents. And they also talked about practices that they wanted present in schools to feel safe, like ventilation in classrooms, teachers being vaccinated, social distancing, mandatory masking, regular COVID testing. We know those things aren't present in some schools that are opening right now.
I'm curious what both of you think about the speed at which this is happening. One of the most interesting things I found in Minnesota was when I asked about how many online programs had been approved in pre-COVID, and over 25 years it was something like 50 programs. And I haven't checked the numbers recently, but we're on track to approve at least 100 new ones just this year. And there are districts basically putting together, programs that they intend to be permanent in a matter of months, processes that maybe they'd had a 5-year plan for or they've been thinking about. So this is accelerated in a lot of places for some of those reasons. Districts don't want to lose kids. But I wonder, when we're thinking about all these best practices and everything that needs to be different to make this as rigorous as traditional school, what do you think about how quickly this is unfolding everywhere and what that might mean for kind of the quality control issues?
Well, quality control is a big issue. And, not all states are requiring approval of some virtual learning programs. In some states, some schools you just want to start an online program, you do it, and you might develop it yourself and build your own content, or you might find a provider of courses. Like Michigan Virtual, for example, there are some schools that don't have the capacity to develop themselves, so they use our courses and our teachers. And you can do that. When schools try to build these programs on their own rapidly, we have a tendency to see that they struggle in the very beginning because instructional design for virtual learning is different than designing instruction for face-to-face. And not a lot of teachers have experience designing for virtual spaces. So yeah, I mean, we really don't have a choice but to build rapidly when the demand is there and we're trying to satisfy the needs and the wants of our communities. And then just if there's going to be school closures again, we need to be prepared for that. So there's the underlying tension to do it anyway, even if nobody's really asking for it directly. So we're there, and as you go through that process, and you try to rush something that just takes time by nature, you do sacrifice quality, and that's a big risk.
Yeah, and I think just our work has pointed out just the disparities in what instruction looked like when you're online versus not. I mean, if you're opting to go online and you have the technology, some of that will go away. But there's a real question when districts are offering these virtual schools, how different are they going to look from in-person instruction? Of course, they should look different in a lot of ways. And Chris, could talk really knowledgeably about all the ways that they should look different. But it does mean that students are getting something different. And it's important to think about the equity concerns there, especially if we have more students of color pursuing those virtual options.
One thing that I think would be of interest to reporters anywhere, because as you said, this can vary so much, is kind of the ecosystem around online learning. That's something that's been really interesting to me as I've dug more into this. I didn't really realize how complex it was, where you've got, now you've got school districts, charter schools, outside for-profit companies, the education management organizations or EMOs, nonprofits, depending on where your state, who's operating there is very different. I know that's a whole wormhole to get into, but I wondered if either or both of you could just kind of give people, kind of an outline of the shape of that, of just like how complicated of a subject this is, just beyond the nuts and bolts of, can kids log on and how's the teaching, but like the bigger picture of who's involved here.
Yeah, do you have thoughts on that, Julia? I do.
I feel like it's not, I think it's more in your wheelhouse than mine, but the one thing I keep thinking about all the time, because this is part of a different study we're doing, is what that means for the curriculum materials that are being used, because there are lots of good curriculum materials that aren't available online, and there are lots of not so great curriculum materials that are available online. And so, I think teachers tend to go to lots of different places to get their materials. And so one thing that I think about a lot is whether these virtual schools will be offering really good instructional opportunities. And I think that's really hard, as Chris said, and it's just something that you need to build a lot of capacity on in order for students not to just be drilling something, in some kind of like digital material. And so that's something I think about a lot, but I bet Chris has some great ecosystem kinds of ideas to share.
It's really messy. It's really complicated, as you said, Erin. So the question becomes, if I want to offer online learning for my kids in my school district, I have two ways I can do it. I can build it or curate it myself, or I can take advantage of some organizations who have already created content and buy their courses or lease their courses. I could have their teachers teach it, or I can have my teachers teach the content that they created, okay? For a lot of schools and districts, that's the better way to go, especially we see it a lot in smaller districts where you just don't have capacity of staff to be able to do all this work. what are you going to do? I mean, if you don't have people and you don't have time, what are your choices really? So they move in that direction. An advantage to that is the fact that these organizations, these providers, have trained instructional design teams that this is what they do, this is their expertise, and they can create some very high quality content. On the flip side, schools who want to go this route and build it themselves or pull open educational resources and design their curriculum, their digital curriculum that way, they can do it. It does take time and it takes iteration. The first shot at it, it's okay. It's not amazing. And then you just have to evolve that. So it does take time. So to do something rapidly is difficult. The advantage of building it yourself is this. If you build it yourself for virtual students, you can use that same content in your face-to-face classes, so you can have content that mirrors the rigor and pacing of your face-to-face. How kids engage with the content, engage with each other and the teacher is different because they're virtual, but it's the same scope and sequence and rigor. And that's really important to understand. If I have a face-to-face course or a face-to-face experience for kids, and I have I'm purchasing content from a vendor, any kids who want to move from one format to another, from online to face-to-face, there's going to be gaps. There might be overlap. There might be gaps in learning because that scope and sequence is different. If you build it yourself, it's highly customizable and you can mold it and shape it however you want, but it's harder and it takes longer. And you know, so if somebody asked me today, what's the best way to go? Well, I have about 100 questions to ask you first before I would give you a recommendation, because it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to serve, and what your longer term goals are. But I will say this, you can have exceptional and high quality learning experiences in a virtual space with either one. But it's not just the content, it's not just the teachers. It goes back to those 360-degree supports that I mentioned earlier.
Right. Thank you. It's helpful.
Hello. So Eric back here from EWA. I want to offer one of the audience questions that came up. I also though want to plant a seed for something. Erin, I want maybe you to think about this for sure, and also Julia and Chris, you know, of what would be 2 or 3 very kind of concrete stories, angles that any reporter could pursue, you know, that isn't going to take them 3 weeks, but, you know, it could be an angle around, you know, whatever it might be. So if they wanted to kind of start chipping away at this, because I don't think one story would tell the whole thing, but if you can give them a few ideas of different stories to tell. And frankly, this next one might be a great example. There's a question about whether the speakers have any data or insights specifically tailored for how students with disabilities have been doing with virtual learning. That could be a great story, by the way, in any community.
I was just thinking that, Eric, when you raised that point about finding an angle. I think the students with disabilities angle is a really complicated one. And of course, we've seen stories, children that have some disabilities that can learn better at home. But then, you know, we've heard terrible stories about students who really need an aid or a support, especially if they have severe disabilities, just not being able to get that aid. And so it's basically a full-time job for parents to support that child at home. And really hard over the course of the pandemic, including this past school year, because schools just weren't really always up to the capacity they had before to provide supports for those students. So I think the disabilities question is a complicated one, and teachers have told us, about 1/3 of the teachers we surveyed back in October told us they were not getting adequate guidance to support those populations. So they're not getting adequate guidance. I mean, to support those children at home, some kids, it works for them. It works even better because they don't have the distractions of being in a classroom. But for a lot of kids, it's not going to work as well. They need some face-to-face support.
Yeah. I'll add to that, Julia. When schools develop their own programs and they design their own content, and even if they use a third-party provider for that, when those students are are taking supplemental courses, meaning it supplements their traditional face-to-face schedules, all those services are provided in-house in the school district. So it's something that the kids end up coming back because that's where they're better supported. And across the board, that's where we're seeing schools putting that kind of expertise and that kind of support in their own hands and removing it from the virtual experience.
I know too, we'd had some discussion we have a caucus, a group of education journalists who have been working together in recent months on teaching and learning stories. Another sort of population you might consider for this kind of story would be English language learners. Are there, what are the experiences there too, especially in school systems that often have quite a lot of different languages that they need to address. I'm curious too about, as reporters kind of want to wade into this, and as they want to start asking, about any school system or charter or whomever's doing this, as they come across them, they want to ask a few questions to kind of help get grounded. What are some of the basic questions, and what are some of the answers that might be red flags that something is not going to adhere to best practices? I know that journalists would be leery about making those judgments themselves, and maybe they'll turn to experts like you to share what they're learning. But what are some of the red flags that maybe a program is not well designed?
Well, I think first of all, I think purchases of programs this year are something that we should be paying a lot of attention to. All this money is going to lots of things, but it's also going to purchasing a lot of curriculum, a lot of online supports, a lot of technology. And when we look at surveys, what really interesting pattern we find is that school systems, district superintendents will say, we adopted this, everybody's using it. School leaders will say, we adopted this, some teachers are using it. And then when you go to the teacher level, a lot of teachers don't even report using it. And then if you go to the student level, a lot of students report not using it. So I think use, right, these programs aren't going to work unless they're actually used, right? Tutoring, we've heard that again and again, that when you have a lot of tutors, the students that take advantage of them aren't always the kids that really, really need the tutoring. So just kind of thinking about both programs that are purchased and the quality of them, but also who's actually using them, and if they bought into those programs being good programs is a question that I wonder about.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I would add that I think if you ask school leaders about their process of adopting digital content and courses that they're going to be using, asking what that process looked like, if there was a structurally sound evaluation process and selection process, something that talks about how the curriculum was designed and what instructional frameworks it's designed within. I think that's really important. I think another piece to getting some insight on whether or not a school district has a strong plan for being effective with their virtual learning is how are they supporting the teachers through professional development, but then also what supports are available for students who do disengage. And it happens. It's a lot easier. Like if I just turn my my camera off right now, you wouldn't know if I'm engaged or not. There are a lot of kids who kept their cameras off last year for a lot of different reasons. And when you do something like that and you start losing that kind of engagement, how are school leaders helping support teachers to make sure students are engaged? If professional development is only for teachers, teachers soon find themselves at the end of what they can do. And there are some very critical pieces of teacher supervision and how administrators can support teachers that make the whole virtual learning experience work. So, seeing what's that interplay between teachers and administrators and these supports for both the teachers and the kids, that'll give you a lot of insight.
That's such a good point, Chris. I feel like the materials that are going to be most helpful to teachers this year are the materials that include assessments so that teachers know how students are doing, can figure out which students are behind, and then have specific strategies within those materials, within school plans, within district plans for how to help those students. And I mean, I'm sure, Chris, you've seen virtual learning schools that do that, or ones that intend to do that, but just don't quite find ways to connect the dots sometimes, looking at the students that are falling through the cracks.
You know, it's
Exactly.
interesting. I'm glad, Chris, you raised the issue of cameras on, cameras off. And I know, you know, mandating it might be a little more heavy-handed. There's some concerns about whether it's privacy or other issues. But is it a red flag if most kids have their cameras off? You know, should schools that do this push hard to get as many kids where there's not a compelling reason they shouldn't have their camera on, to really have it on to make it an engaging experience?
Well, here again, I'm going to make a differentiation between pandemic teaching and learning and effective virtual learning. In pandemic teaching and learning, and a kid's just kind of parked in front of a computer at the dining room table, and the rest of the family is also locked in the household. Yes, there are experiences of dad walking across the background, scratching his bare chest because he's walking around without a shirt on. There is an experience of one student who had to shut down and log off quickly because the smoke detector went off because somebody burned food in the kitchen next, you know, in the next room. These are like real things that happen during pandemic teaching and learning that you can't control. But if you were if you're designing a virtual learning program, you need to establish norms and what are the expectations. And one of those being cameras on, and get your learning environment in a place where you can actually do that kind of a thing. Because yeah, there might be some embarrassment about where somebody lives, you know, or you know, just some other distractions that reasons why somebody wouldn't want to be on camera. But if that's one of the norms and that's established ahead of time, those students opting into online learning, then you do that, and you can kind of mitigate some of that, you know, camera off thing if that's an issue. I can tell you that it was a big complaint with schools and districts I worked with last year that kids would not be turning their cameras on. What could they do? You know, it wasn't an established norm, and it was what it was, and there was no recourse for teachers really, simply because, you know, if a child's completing their work, yeah, you might not be able to see them, and they might not be able to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, whether they understand something. But in the case of pandemic teaching and learning, that was, you know, that's one of many things that they were concerned about and then could address. So, you know, it just was what it was. But if you can pre-plan for these things and establish some of these structures and expectations, it'll go a long way.
I think one thing to quickly note on that subject that surprised me in my reporting is I think a lot of people think about virtual learning and they're thinking about those issues like kid in front of the computer, class happening. But it's really surprised me as I've talked to so many districts in Minnesota making their plans that a lot of these programs have very, very little synchronous instruction. So it may be a case where you are never logging on in front of a live person. Maybe the way you're connecting with your teacher is by phone once every 2 weeks. I mean, in some cases, I wrote about in one story a program that kind of blew up for a variety of quality control reasons, but students were just filling out a worksheet once every couple weeks, and that was it. So I think those can be potential red flags. There are certainly programs that are designed that way for students who can work more independently. But I think especially if it's like an elementary school or middle school program maybe, and there's not, you know, much of that happening, it could be a great place to just be asking some questions in your reporting about how this actually works and how schools are staying connected to kids.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Erin. You know, so here's a list, you know, is it synchronous or asynchronous? You know, what's the rules on cameras and why? I know another thing that came up even a year ago, we had a webinar about attendance and what counts as attendance. You know, if you're in the class for 5 minutes and then you log off, does that count? Or do you have to stay the whole time? Because there was a lot of cases of that. Sometimes actually there's been cases of for-profit organizations counting and collecting money from a state for attendance where kids really weren't there, but just kind of showed up for a second. I'm curious though, Erin, for you, what are a few of the other questions when you have talked to the operators, whether it's a school district or someone else, that elicited some of the best information, you know, that kind of helped you kind of dive in and start to figure out some of the compelling stories you wanted to tell?
I think one of the most interesting stories right now is who's creating these programs and why, and what's really driving it, because it can be such a variety. It can be districts who've really deliberately been thinking about this for maybe 5 or 10 years and slowly building up a program. And then there's some, you know, at least here where there's full school choice, you can go to any district you want, that are just panicking, for lack of a better word, that they're going to lose students. They got to build something. They know it's a thing, and there might be kids who want to do it. And then digging a little bit more on that and asking, okay, so then how have you made the decisions about, you know, what programs you're going to use? What stood out to you if you know, purchased one of these programs? Are you using your own teachers? Are you going to use, you know, someone else's? How are you thinking about measuring success here? Who's teaching and what's that going to look like? And you know, I think there's probably a real wide variety of answers you get. There's some that have kind of everything planned out. They know exactly what the systems are going to look like. And there's some here anyway, you know, we're a week or so out from school. And I think if a parent asks questions about who's going to be teaching this, it's still a little bit like, we're going to figure it out. And one other thing too, I think, because we're still in this weird COVID moment of virtual learning, that you know, there are a lot of places that are working very diligently to make sure that these are separate things. The teachers teaching online are only doing that because that was a huge issue for a lot of educators. But there may still be a lot of places where ultimately teachers end up doing a little bit of both, and that could be a major staffing and just logistical concern for a lot of districts.
And I'll just mention the report that we had coming out on Monday that also looked at school districts' plans for the services they're going to provide this year. And, you know, whereas about a large percentage of districts are providing now computing devices, many more than past years, many more providing tech support for families, we were kind of surprised we didn't see as much like of the innovative things that we were thinking would come up after the past year's experience, you know, like pods. That's been quite a conversation, learning pods. We didn't see a lot of districts saying they're offering those, very few. And they in fact didn't talk about parents demanding a lot of really innovative things beyond just providing a virtual option. So they may not feel a push to be as innovative as they could be.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent does the virtual environment sort of support or make possible you know, some of the hallmarks of you know, high quality instruction, you know, whether you're sort of you know, working to make sure that kids are collaborating together, you know, learning independently, critical thinking, developing an academic mindset, some of the things that kind of like some people refer to as like deeper learning. I mean, are there things about the virtual experience that can make it a great way for that kind of complexity of teaching and learning, or is it a lot harder to do?
It is very possible to do that. I will say for those teachers who were thrust into the pandemic teaching and learning, that is so far down the road, just because they were in survival mode. As teachers go further and further into this remote learning or virtual learning, they get more experience and they can start doing more. They can settle in. It's no different than a teacher who just receives their teaching degree right out of college. They become that first year teacher. They're just trying to hold their ground, right? And it's not until you get experience doing that that you can start going further and further, and you learn more. You go through some professional development, you can practice it, you can try things out, and you just evolve that way. So yes, it does happen, but I would say that's kind of like, you know, like the next phase of virtual teaching. And there's some foundational pieces that have to get there first. To do things synchronously, and this is why so many people struggled, to Erin's point about, you know, trying to teach, you know, simulcasting or live streaming your lessons to virtual kids while you have face-to-face kids in front of you. That's super hard to do for most teachers, not all. There were some teachers that I've worked with directly that just thrived in that, and they did an amazing job with it. but that was not the norm. But they already had some experience before. So that kind of a thing, plus providing some formative assessments online and developing good project-based learning and collaborative activities. That's next level stuff, right?
Mhm.
It is very doable. It's all very possible. And I've seen firsthand evidence of virtual courses that were far better than face-to-face courses that I've seen. Okay.
We're just about out of, okay. I'm sorry. We're just about out of time. One rapid fire last round of like 15-second answers, including you, Erin, if you want to chime in. Like, what is one piece of quick advice you have for journalists out there who want to learn more about this topic in their own communities?
Mine is talk to parents and students, because what you hear from districts might not be reflected in their experiences, and you can learn a lot and ask better questions.
Great. Chris?
I would say there are a lot of negative things that can be brought to light as a result of pandemic teaching and learning, but ask about the success stories, because that can help illustrate some of the potential that's out there.
Great. Julia?
Yeah, and I'm just going to provide a very researchy response and say it's great if you can find some data from schools on what's happening on the ground, percentages of students that have online access, information about what courses are being offered online. And then again, going to the parents and kids, as Erin said, really important to understand what's happening.
Thank you all so much. I want to thank our guests, Erin Golden of the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, Julia Kaufman of the RAND Corporation, Christopher Harrington of the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. And of course, I also want to thank our attendees today for coming and joining us. As soon as this webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is so important and helps us improve. Finally, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for upcoming webinars, including one next week on teacher retirement plans. That's all. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.